Certainly a very interesting experiment as well in the UK. And I directly give the floor to Eleanor and Sarah.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for having us here today. It's a real privilege to be participating in this conference and to be in the beautiful city of Florence as well. My colleague Sarah and I come from the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre, which is a UK police-led multi-agency centre dedicated to combating child sexual abuse. In the centre we have a mixed range of staff whereby police officers work alongside social workers and intelligence analysts to actually try and identify threats to children and work out how we can actually try to prevent harm. One of the key threats that we deal with at the centre is transnational child sexual abuse, and our main focus in this area is where British nationals actually travel to overseas in order to sexually abuse and or exploit children. And what we're going to talk to you about today is really an overview, a very brief overview of what we've identified the threat that British nationals pose overseas, and my colleague Sarah is then going to talk to you about some prevention initiatives that we use to try and reduce the harm that those individuals may pose. Okay. So very quickly, I'm just going to talk to you about the two main types of overseas offending that we think about back at CEOP in the UK. And the reason we've tried to think about offending in these ways is to help try and actually target our prevention work. The first main group of offenders we've called transient offending. And this kind of offending is really what we would understand by the term child sex tourism. And the emphasis here is on individuals who are in and out of a region, a country, or a town in order to abuse children there. But they don't probably stay there for a long time, and they don't abuse the same children over a long period of time. Now, this presents quite unique challenges to law enforcement in trying to actually deter these individuals from offending. The second main category there we've called embedded offending, and this is a broad group of offenders who actually embed themselves in societies overseas, either through their occupation, for example, working in a school or an orphanage, and the abuse that they perpetrate is likely to be against probably the same group of children, but it's likely to be quite prolific and extensive. These individuals are less likely to actually live in the UK and so present quite a distinct threat from people who are committing transient offending because they're not necessarily ever under the direct jurisdiction of UK policing. Don't label the offender is just a note because I've actually done it myself this morning. But these two terms relate to types of offending rather than types of individual, because you might have individuals who actually sadly sexually abuse children using both of these methods. So very briefly, I'm talking specifically about British people who go overseas, unfortunately, in some instances, to sexually abuse children. And in 2012, 104 individuals who are suspected of or we are known to be perpetrating these crimes overseas were identified to our agency. And most of these individuals weren't previously known to law enforcement. And that was an important learning point for us because it means that these are individuals who aren't in the main known to us in the UK as child sex offenders, making them particularly challenging to identify when they are abusing internationally. In terms of demographics, 99% of those 104 people that we found out about in 2012 were male. And I've put a little graph up here which shows that the age range of these individuals was actually at the older end of the spectrum, with the most common age range being 51 to 60 years old, which is different from the type of child sex offender we deal with in the UK who offends in the online internet arena. Where? It's a big question. Of those individuals who were known to CEOP in the year 2012, 75% of those offences were actually suspected to be or known to be committed in North America, West Europe, North Europe, and Australia and New Zealand. And that was quite surprising to us in some respects because these are clearly Western developed countries and where you wouldn't necessarily expect children to be more vulnerable to abuse. However, what is also common to many of these nations in these areas is quite a robust law enforcement response to child sexual abuse and exploitation and robust legislation, as well as good information sharing with the United Kingdom, which means overall that they are more likely to identify offending and then we're more likely to find out about it. The orange regions, the 23%, are regions whereby a lot of countries are actually have developing economies. A lot of individuals in those countries suffer in conditions of poverty. There are lower levels of education and perhaps weaker law enforcement responses and legislation to this type of crime, which makes children particularly more vulnerable there. Of those countries, I don't know if you can see from the graph, but the majority of individuals that we know about were actually committing offences in Southeast Asia, but it also included some countries in East Europe, South Europe, Central America, and parts of Africa also. And I will now pass over to my colleague Sarah, who's going to talk about the prevention initiatives that we've developed to try and reduce the harm these individuals cause.
Thank you, Eleanor.